Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are connecting from. I'm delighted to be chairing session 2A on refugees, the convention, and access to work and health. We have a great lineup of speakers this afternoon, and they're going to speak for 10 minutes each, and I'll introduce them sequentially. And of course, there's an opportunity to ask questions. The moderators have been asked to receive your questions in the chat box. Just make sure when you're entering your questions that you put it both to the panelists and the attendees so everybody can see those. And of course, I'd also encourage you to chat in the chat box and respond to questions that you might also see. Would ask if you could keep your microphones and videos off for the duration. And I think with that, we are ready to proceed. So this panel, as I said, is on refugees, the convention, and access to work and health. And just a little introduction that this is obviously one of the right to work in particular, is an area that I've been studying for a number of years, but is one of the most important global rights, yet it is often framed not as an obligation of states, but more as in the realm of state discretion. And I've also noticed too that in the latest UNHCR documents, for example, on resettlement or solutions, the language has shifted from the right to work to language such as livelihoods, self-reliance, and so forth. And I wonder whether that means something as we move forward. So let's see what our panelists have to say about developments as well as challenges and whether they have any possible solutions. So I'm delighted to invite Dr. Diana Albergini, who is going to speak to us on Showing Its Age, the 1951 Convention and the Right to Work, and she's an independent researcher from the United States. Diana, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. I've prepared some slides. Hopefully it would make it easier to, it would make it easier to follow the presentation. There we go. Okay, I'm going to talk about the right to work, and I'm going to refer specifically to the example of Ethiopia. So today I will start my presentation with a discussion of some of the restrictions contained in Articles 17, 18, 19 of the 1951 Convention. And I will argue through the example of Ethiopia that the right to work, as enshrined in the 1951 Convention, is showing its age, as it does not appear adequate to support refugees' self-reliance initiatives. I would like to start by pointing out that restrictions start within the 1951 Convention. So first of all, refugees are not treated on par with nationals, but granted the most favorable treatment according to foreign nationals, or treatment as favorable as possible. And this is indeed a problematic area, especially considering that restrictions to protect the national labor markets are lifted after 3 years, which is a fairly long time, and that the concepts indicating residence, such as lawfully staying and lawfully in, are open to interpretation. So in practice, these restrictions allow states to adopt a narrow interpretation of the 1951 Convention's right to work. And by doing so, they effectively prevent refugees from accessing the labor market. So by putting refugees on the same level as foreign nationals, this allows states to apply measures in order to protect their own national labor market. So for instance, they can require refugees to obtain permits, and then they can apply criteria to make these permits almost impossible to obtain. And, you know, often work permits permits are only available for positions that national workers cannot occupy, which makes it really hard for refugees to justify why they should have that job. They can be time limited, they can be costly, they can require employers' letters, so on and so forth. States can also make reservations. Some of the most common are treating provisions as recommendations and not as obligations, and also excluding foreign nationals with a privileged status. So my main point here, sorry, I went too fast. My main point here is that states can actually adopt a restrictive approach, but still stay within the confines of the 1901 Convention. So if we take Ethiopia as a case study, I actually put a lot of information on this slide, but I just wanted to give you a bit of a context, but I will just summarize some of the key points. So Ethiopia is home to around 800,000 refugees, and it has been operating a strict encampment policy and did not grant the right to work. It is a signatory of the 1951 Convention, but it has made a reservation to Article 17, paragraph 2, which it recognizes only as recommendation. In recent years, it has benefited from an incredible economic growth, but it is struggling to create jobs. And it has the very ambitious goal of transitioning to a lower middle income country by 2025. So here are some key dates about Ethiopia. So in 2016, Ethiopia made 9 pledges, including the pledge to expand refugees' access to employment. And then in 2018, it became the recipient of $500 million to advance the establishment of its industrial park and fulfill one of its pledges. And this initiative is normally known as the Jobs Compact, and it aims to create 100,000 jobs, 30,000 of which can be allocated to refugees, should be allocated to refugees. So then in 2019, Ethiopia approved a new refugee proclamation. And in this regard, I would like to highlight that the reform of the legal framework concerning refugees was actually a precondition for the funds to be for the funds of the job compacts to be disbursed. So again, here is a little table to give you a bit of an overview of the old proclamation versus the new proclamation. It's immediately clear that the new proclamation is much more complete. The 2004 proclamation only said that refugees had to be treated as foreign nationals, while the 2016 is more complete, more articulated. It is aligned with Article 17 of the 1951 Convention, as it states that refugees should be granted the most favorable treatment as accorded to foreign nationals. It extends the right to engage in wage earning employment and self-employment to both recognized refugees and asylum seekers. So in this way, it's almost more expansive than the 1951 Convention. And similarly to the 1951 Convention, it lifts restrictions in the case of refugees married to Ethiopians or parents of Ethiopian children. So last, I would quickly like to draw your attention to what has been defined as the most progressive aspect of the 2019 proclamation, which is the sub-article which sees the puts refugees on par with nationals when engaged in projects designed by the Ethiopian government and the international community. In substance, this is the sub-article that legally enables the Jobs Compact. So what does this all mean in practice? Well, in practice, wage earning, when it comes to, first of all, when it comes to the most favorable treatment of foreign nationals in Ethiopia, I need to say that there is a group in Ethiopia which is called the Foreigners of Ethiopian Origins. And this is, they have various privileges, among which is the fact that they are exempt from having to obtain work permits. So there is a legal argument that refugees should actually be treated as foreigners of Ethiopian origin and benefit from the same privileges. However, there was a directive that came out in 2020, which clarified that in order to be able to work, refugees are indeed required to have a permit. So because they need a permit, which is only available for jobs which Ethiopians cannot perform, it is important to notice that not much seems to have changed especially regard wage earning employment, given that permits are still almost impossible to obtain. Moreover, self-employment, which was not even mentioned in the previous proclamation, requires a business license and an investment permit. But in order to get an investment permit, the minimum capital is $200,000, which effectively puts also self-employment out of reach for refugees. The interesting aspect is that the only instance when refugees are not required a work permit is for one of those 30,000 jobs that should be created as part of the Jobs Compact. So in essence, Ethiopia continues to protect its national labor market by making work permits very hard to obtain and not giving refugees the most favorable treatment as accorded to foreign nationals. So by adopting the development approach, it seems that it has enabled Ethiopia to put into place a system whereby it will allocate jobs to refugees only provided it receives international financial support. So in conclusion, employment to refugees becomes entirely contingent upon international investment. So this is my final slide and I'd like to leave you with some final considerations and also some open questions. First of all, I think that while the 1951 convention can provide a baseline, the right to work as codified in Articles 17, 18, and 19 of the 1951 Convention is inadequate to promote refugees' economic inclusion. And I think the Ethiopian example shows this. So in the case of Ethiopia, the development approach has actually provided two main things. It has provided the incentive to reform the proclamation. It is doubtful whether the proclamation would ever been reformed without this incentive. It has also triggered the most progressive provision. So it leaves me a bit with the question of what is the contribution of the 1951 Convention in providing a response to the promotion of self-reliance and in sustaining, in promoting refugees' economic inclusion, when the articles that are actually based on the 1951 conventions are the articles that are not leading to economic inclusions, but in fact are those that are not giving refugees access to the labor market. And then finally, I was just wondering, so the development approach seems more able to provide a practical response and to come up with practical solutions to implement self-reliance strategies. However, what's going to happen to refugees' rights? Are they going to be undermined, and are they going to be prevailed upon by other stakeholders' interests? So this is perhaps a question we can discuss. And it is still very early days because unfortunately COVID has interrupted the establishment of the industrial parks. It has slowed down factories and so on. So it is still early days to understand exactly how this is going to pan out. But the job compacts has already shown not to be particularly refugee-centered, and he actually has already he has already exposed refugees and local workers to exploitation. So perhaps this is another area which we can discuss which we can discuss further. So here I come to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Diana. A lot of thorough research included, and I think it's good that you provoked us with these questions at the end. So let's keep them in mind for the chat. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
We move now to Emily Arnold-Fernández, who is with Asylum Access, United States and Mexico, and looking at refugees' economic rights and the legacy of the 1951 Convention. Let's see if she's going to give us a different angle than Diana. So over to you, Emily.
Thank you, Alice. And I should say I was supposed to have I was potentially going to have a co-author on this paper who was writing from Mexico, but Asylum Access works in a wide range of locations around the world. Thanks for having me here. I will start maybe by framing my paper as, at the time the 1951 Convention was drafted, refugees' economic rights were at least of equal status to their civil and political rights, potentially or arguably even seen as more important. But when we look at the past 70 years, we see that refugees' economic rights, to a greater degree than their civil and political rights, have been sidelined, have been ignored. And so this paper investigates why and how that happened. And I'll maybe start by saying that I disagree a bit with Diana in that I do feel that the convention is strong on economic rights, including work rights, and we can debate the details in our Q&A session. But I think the problem lies not with the convention itself, but with how the convention has been promoted, how states have been held accountable for refugees' economic rights, work rights, and beyond. So when we talk about economic rights, we're talking about things like property ownership, like employment and labor rights, rights at work, rationing, housing, education, public relief, social security. And when we talk about civil rights, we're talking about freedom of religion, recognition of personal status and legal status, freedom of association, access to courts and to administrative assistance by the government, free movement, issuance of identity and travel documents, non-refoulement, as some examples. That's not a fully comprehensive list, but those are the rights we're talking about in the 1951 Convention, extended globally through the 1967 Protocol. When we look at the Travaux, when we look at how drafters looked at economic rights as they were writing the convention, we saw that they believed that economic rights were central to restoring refugees' lives. And in fact, the US representative to the drafting committee, Louis Henkin, said that without the right to work, all other rights were meaningless. So we can see that the drafters gave considerable weight to economic rights. And in fact, just in the structure of the convention itself, 2 of the 6 chapters are exclusively dedicated to economic rights. And there are a total of 12 economic rights and 12 civil rights. So we see that just in terms of the number of rights, they're equal as well. And we see that the drafters were right to prioritize and give importance to economic rights, as economic rights have been ignored, have been sidelined. Refugees are far more likely than nationals to live in poverty. And the flip, the converse of that is that where countries have granted economic rights to refugees, there has been economic benefit to host countries as a whole, to communities and economies as a whole. In practice, what we've seen is that as the legacy of the 1951 Convention moved on, refugees have not been granted access to state education and health systems. They have not been included in housing subsidies or social security programs. And this becomes more obvious, not immediately following the 1951 Convention's entry into force, but over time. So in the 1950s in Europe and in the 1950s and 60s in Africa, most refugees voluntarily repatriated after a few years. And in Africa, where refugees did integrate, they tended to self-integrate within their own ethnic groups. And so there was not a lot of state support for integration at all. But as we move to the 1970s and increases in the numbers of people displaced and the length of time for which they're displaced, we see that first organized settlements and then internment camps where refugees were reliant on foreign aid, there was still equitable access to civil and political rights in many cases, to issuance of identity documents, to personal status recognition, to freedom of religion, to non-refoulement. The key exception on the civil rights was movement. There was not freedom of movement in the internment camps, but most other civil rights were in fact honored. Economic rights, on the other hand, were not honored. Refugees had little access to markets, little access to wage earning or self-employment. They were not allowed to own property, are not allowed to own property. They don't have access to primary education on an equal basis with nationals. And we see this not just in Africa, but also in Asia as displacement grew there in the 70s and 80s. And more recently, we've seen that, as an example, in Africa, African countries have dramatically expanded their social security systems for nationals over the past 2 decades. In 2003, most countries in Africa had some sort of social security for old age and disability, and that has only expanded. By 2019, the scope of social security programs was much greater, and yet those programs have not been extended to refugees. So why did this happen? There's been some scholarship on the development of economic rights and the importance given or lack of importance given to economic rights in regard to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so there's been scholarship documenting the impact of Cold War politics and also the US civil rights movement on the kind of denigration of economic rights in that convention. There hasn't really been a look at how this played out in light of in the face of the Refugee Convention. And so that's what this paper attempts to do. And in the interest of time, I won't be able to get into all of it, but we can hopefully discuss more in the Q&A session. But basically, there are 2 key trends that occurred almost as soon as the ink was dry on the 1951 convention. The first was that the so-called Western countries began to de-emphasize economic rights as part of an ideological split with the Soviet Union, or the so-called Eastern states, and I'm using these terms advisedly, but they were the terms used at the times, where the so-called Western states were promoting civil and political rights as the primary means to a just and fair society, whereas the Soviet and Eastern countries were emphasizing economic rights and prioritizing those over civil and political rights, both in their discourse and to some extent in their practice as well. At the same time, we saw that the US was emerging in the 1950s as a dominant global power, as Western Europe was forced to rebuild after World War II. And the US remains today the largest provider of refugee assistance funding, which makes it gives it outsized power in shaping the displacement response system.
Emily, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Alice. At the same time, we see that the US civil rights movement began with calls for human rights for people of color in the US, particularly Black and African American people. And the US government and other thought leaders really intentionally shifted to push the terminology civil rights and to push the idea that the movement was about civil rights rather than being about civil and economic rights. And so for those of you who remember Martin Luther King's March on Washington, it was the March for Jobs and Freedom. It had economic rights at its heart. But moving away from economic rights was a way to limit liability, either actual legal liability in US courts based on international conventions, or kind of reputational liability, if you will, for failing to uphold the economic rights of Black people in the US. And thus, as well, as a way to limit the power of this civil rights movement, because it was focused on formal civil rights and not focused on redressing economic disparities, either at the individual level or at the national level through things like reparations. And so what we see today is that there's starting to be a renewed interest in refugees' economic rights. We see this in particular in the renewed interest in the right to work and initiatives like the Ethiopia initiative that Diana talked about. There is increasingly recognition that national policies need to allow and promote refugees' economic rights, respect, protect, and promote refugees' economic rights. But we also see a danger that some of these conversations are taking a particularly extractive turn. So there's discussion of refugees' right to work, but not discussion of refugees' rights at work. Refugees are being positioned to host countries as an exploitable resource. And obviously that's highly problematic. So what can we do about that? Well, I'm hoping we can all discuss that in the Q&A, because I certainly don't have all the answers. But I do think that we can insist on the full range of economic rights, labor rights and rights at work, social security, public relief, basically the full mainstreaming of refugees, not just access to labor markets in a very narrow formal sense. And that where we are promoting labor market access through development schemes, these should include legal empowerment for refugees so they're able to protect their rights at work. Finally, we can pursue economic rights through greater funding and investment in strategic litigation to uphold these rights. The new Strategic Litigation Council for Refugee Rights that will be launched at the Strategic Litigation Roundtable coming up in a few months is an example of one vehicle for that. But I think there are many more to create a body of jurisprudence that really supports refugees' economic rights. And I'd love to hear other ideas that the audience has when we get into the Q&A.
Lovely. Thank you, Emily, for this very strong paper, and also for taking up the challenge to see if you agreed with Diana in the sense of the relevance of the 1951 convention. I also appreciated you looking at the historical progression, or should we say regression, in relation to work rights, at least as it affects the United States. So moving to the third paper by Tamara, Kool. And this is around otherness in the labour market and a closer look at economic inclusion or potentially exclusion. Tamara, you will explain to us. And she's looking at the particular case study of Jordan. Thank you. Over to you, Tamara. Your microphone is muted.
My apologies for that. Zoom is nice. It just brings with it its technicalities, of course. So yes, I will take you now to Jordan in that sense. So for my own for the paper that I'm going to present today, this is part of a larger PhD project that I've been working on, which is the policy responses to regional-based refugees, explaining differences in labor market outcomes. Within that, I particularly look at the case of Syrian and Palestinian refugees in Jordan. I try to understand, first of all, how is their access to labor market shaped, and under what conditions are they able to engage in the labor market? And of course, the legal side, the legal story is part of the answer, but I also argue that we need to consider the heterogeneity of refugees, as well as the socio-economic dimensions. So within my own research, I actually approach it from a social exclusion lens, where I try to understand both the differences between different groups of refugees and the Jordanian host community, as well as understanding the differences within the refugee groups, as this also has an effect on the outcomes and the ability to even realize their rights. So for this particular study, what I'll do now is I'll just give you a snapshot, and then I'll go more in depth. So I actually, I've done a legal analysis, and then combined with that, I have done, in part, I conducted interviews in Jordan with 70 Syrian and Palestinian refugees located in and outside camps. And I did 2 focus group discussions in Zaatari, where I talked about the labor market experiences. And what I do in this paper is where I set their experiences against the backdrop actually of the legal context. And what you notice is that there is a difference, of course, in terms of the rights and also the practice, which is noticed at the end of the day. But we also need to be very considerate of the differences both between the different groups and within the different groups. So certain legislation has been adopted, which seems to give a preferential treatment amongst others to Syrian refugees, but thus it actually also has some side effects on the Palestinian refugees, which in turn are becoming overlooked. And this spillover effect, if you want to call it that way, is a danger of framing it within the international context. So I try to highlight this within the next few minutes. So very briefly, when we talk about Jordan, of course, we need to recognize that it's not signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention. Nonetheless, it is still a signatory to the International Convention of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And in particularly Articles 6 to 9 are of relevance here with regards to work, but then under Article 2, it does put in place some restrictions with regards to the economic context. So it is considered same as other foreigners. What does this mean? In the case of the Palestinians, and I know I'm skipping over a lot right now, that's the challenge. This is almost a presentation in its own. But in the case of the Palestinians, we need to consider the difference between the Palestinians with Palestinian refugees who have attained a national ID and the Palestinians without a national ID. So the ones without a national ID are primarily ex-Gazan refugees, but then they are taken again as non-Jordanians. And as such, they are classified as foreign laborers under the 1996 labor law. And this has three main implications. There are other implications which I'm happy to discuss at a later stage, but I think these are the three that I briefly want to highlight. Firstly, they require a work permit to be able to engage in the labor market formally, but this work permit is only open to certain sectors. So there is a closed profession list, and this list has also been stated to become a little bit more restricted over time. And then there is the minimum wage. So as of 2012, there is actually a divergence between what the minimum wage is for Jordanians and what the minimum wage is for non-Jordanians. Now, of course, we know that we've seen the Jordan Compact, and this is in a way also what you mentioned before, like larger of a bigger discussion with the Global Compact on also recognizing the need for and the ongoing discussions on recognizing the need for the self-reliance, but we do need a critical look. It can to an extent be seen as a trade-off between human rights, but also the national interest for specific groups. And I think that is also one of the points that I hope to highlight a little bit is what this does. Additionally, it mainly seeks to formalize existing work experiences and places refugees in direct competition with other migrants. And that may actually reflect rather the weak integration into development planning. So what I did, like I said, I did semi-structured interviews and focus group discussions. So here I briefly set out with how many. So I had 35 unique interview moments in the end of the day with 41 Syrians and 31 Palestinians located in Zaatari camp, Hussein camp, Bekaa camp, and Gaza camp or Jerez camp, which name you prefer, and also throughout the country. Now, I would like to note that each case, of course, is not reflective of Jordan at large, but it should be seen as capturing different facets of labor market engagement. So in my interviews, I try to talk to different people, some which are working, some which are not working, some are retired, to also capture the different experiences. And what becomes preeminent is that we need to recognize the intersectionality of dynamics, so where one lives, the gender, the education, but also the background of refugees. Now, overall, there are three elements that and themes that emerge in the interviews. And then those are firstly, what some may refer to as the concept of refugee retier state. The other is the encampment policies, and then the intersectional lens that I mentioned just before. So firstly, with regards to the rentier state, now this is a term that was introduced by Kelperer and Tsurabas, and they did it independent of each other. But the idea behind it is that it is basically capturing the refugees as a way of also attaining aid. And while, of course, the concept may be debatable because it is argued that Jordan has had a long history of rentier state characteristics, the notion is still worthwhile, as it showcases particularly how international interests may lead to attention of one certain refugee groups over the other. And this became very prominent, of course, with the Syrian refugee crisis and the resulting focus on maintaining Syrians also within the region. So the international actors took up a big role, and it led, amongst others, in the culmination of the Jordan Compact. And one of the things under the Jordan Compact was also to assign 200,000 work permits to Syrian refugees. Now, when we look at it, one of the things that we notice is the way that the work permit is being used. So for the Syrians, the work permit is primarily a formalization of existing works, and it only has a limited application to those who have a high education, because the work permit is primarily accessible to 4 or 5 different sectors, which are primarily low-skilled sectors. So those who have a high education are not necessarily able to work within those industries.
2 minutes, Tamara.
2 minutes, oh gosh. The challenge of trying to present something complicated. But then in terms of the Palestinians, in the case of the ex-Gazans, one of the things that was noted is that there is an increase in terms of restrictions. So I have a quote here for one of the interviewees who said, okay, I studied nursing, but then as a result of further restrictions in terms of labor market access, I suddenly was no longer able to continue, so I had to find yet again another job. And if you look at some of the documents that are out there, in a report by the AIDD Legal Aid, they found a closed profession list dated to 2015. At that time, there were 16 professions listed on the closed profession, and this later already became 19 in the UNHCR documentation. I'll try to not rush too much, but to just move forward. The other element is, of course, the encampment. So here we need to be recognizant of the fact that actually, regardless of whether we're talking about Syrian or Palestinian camps, what you do find is this notion of camp economy. Now, of course, this is very clear within the context of Zaatari, but even in the context of Palestinian camps, what you notice is that the camp still is an economy within itself. So it's, and older camps had noted by the time I did my interviews a decline in market activity, which actually, when you asked through it, turns out to be actually rather representative of the economic decline in general. I found a quote by one of the respondents very interesting. He referred to "this is hell, that is heaven." So he referred to Al Hussein camp as hell, whereas Jebel Hussein, which was just across the street, was actually deemed to be a better off place. But at the same time, what we do notice is, next to the perpetuality of the situation, what you do notice is this sense of restrictiveness as well. And of course, this is more prominent in Zaatari, which is a closed camp where you either need a leave permit or work permit to formally leave the camp. In practice, what turns out is that many leave via the Zatar because they need to be on time in their jobs, and the police station is not open in the morning at the time when they need to leave. But even in the urban areas, what you see is that for those refugees, there is a general refusal to live inside the camps, both by Palestinians and by Syrians. but they still seek to find work, even if there are restrictions. It's often that, as one other author, Vincenzo Paris, put it, it's not necessarily citizenship that some of the refugees seek to find, but rather the rights that come with the citizenship. But it puts them at risk of exploitation, and I can address this later on how that works out. If it's okay, I'll skip over this slide. I just want to say with this slide, okay, we need to recognize who is it that we're talking about, what is the level of education, the age, because this also puts into question whether actually some of the policies that are taken are effective or not. But
Tamara,
yeah,
you're past time. Is this, could you, yes, if this is your last slide, great.
Yes. No, absolutely. My sincere apologies. So I just want to reiterate, we have within group differences that actually put some of the practicality of the legal side to question, but we also need to consider that if we put in place certain policies such as opening up work permits, this may have a spillover effect unintended on other refugee groups. But with that, I would like to close, and I'm happy to address questions at a later stage. My apologies for taking so long. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamara. Yes, always difficult to condense rich research, especially research that is in process, especially down to 10 minutes. That's no mean feat. I sympathize, but yes, you can address the responses in the chat session. So moving on to the final paper today, Dr. Mechthild, or Matilda as she says, Roos from Augsburg University, also in the United States, is going to take us now to health rights and access to health. So a variation on, but I'm also very interested to see what lessons we could actually learn. One of the areas I work on is right to work. So what lessons there may be from the right to health. But of course, your paper also stands on its own 2 feet. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so very much. I just realized I didn't correct the program. My bad. I'm based in Germany, in fact, so I'm speaking to you from Germany. I'm gonna share my screen with you as well. And thanks a lot again to the organizers of the panel, to the organizers of the conference. It's a great honor to be in this panel and to present some of my research today, which is on recent policy reforms on asylum seekers and refugees' access to healthcare in 2 EU member states, namely in Germany and Sweden. What I would like to talk to you about today is very quickly give you an overview of the research object of my paper, then quickly present to you the data and then dive into first findings. This is very much work in progress, so I'm very grateful for any kind of comments, critique, inspiration that you might offer. Thank you very much in advance already. So the research object of my paper is the following. What objectives determined Germany's and Sweden's similar responses regarding the political regulation of asylum seekers and refugees' access to healthcare in the wake of the 2015 so-called migration crisis? Now, to break this up a bit, it's rather long, so to break this into its pieces, we have first of all asylum seekers and refugees as target group. I chose to refer to both groups in this paper because I want to make clear that persons both before and after the determination of their legal status are considered. After all, the analyzed policies that I'm looking at apply to persons from both groups, and conditions of applicability are determined in both countries not only by a person's administrative status, but also by the length of their stay in the respective host country. In the context of this study, it's important to note also in connection to the previous papers that asylum seekers and refugees are residents who have not yet contributed to the respective national social security systems, since most of them are not allowed or not able to work, but who have nonetheless healthcare needs beyond emergency care. This makes them an interesting or even difficult target group for national legislators, as I will discuss later on, and thus, of course, also a very interesting target group for us as researchers. This paper focuses specifically on the target group's access to health care as an important aspect of these persons' mid to long-term integration into a host country's society, or similarly of political endeavors to keep them at the margins of society. Healthcare here has then a bridge function, in that it is a precondition for a person's integration not only into society, but, for example, also into the labor market, thus guaranteeing them a permanent self-sufficiency and a permanent position in the society. Healthcare also has a strong symbolic dimension, in that healthcare regimes create insiders and outsiders, not least based on the criterion of deservingness and based on the responsibilities which a state is willing to take over towards its residents, not just citizens, but indeed its residents. So here for this paper, healthcare functions as a lens through which the two states' approach to and treatment of asylum seekers and refugees can be studied, as well as the roles the state attributes to these groups of persons, which then have consequences in all areas of incorporation, not just in the area of health. I look specifically at the political regulation of asylum seekers and refugees' access to healthcare, which means I examine political intentions and the way to legislation rather than looking at the actual implementation. While the latter, the implementation, is also, of course, highly insightful regarding how society and politics deal with this group of persons, particularly in the short term, this paper wants to shed light on how the selected states officially and formally regulate the target groups of rights and duties in the mid to long term. And also at the same time, how politicized this regulation can become, both on and under the surface, particularly during times of crisis, but also in a longer term. While Article 35 of the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which applies in both countries evidently, provides for a fundamental right to health care, this right is so vaguely defined that it leaves the member states with much space for interpretation, notably regarding groups of persons at or even beyond the margins of society, such as, of course, asylum seekers and refugees. I look, as I mentioned, at policy changes in the context of the 2015 so-called migration crisis, while focusing on a period of perceived crisis or actual administrative crisis, however you want to call it. This paper questions to what extent the political measures pursued and adopted at the time were indeed only short-term crisis management, or to what extent they might turn out to shape incorporation policies in the mid to long term, thus becoming really important also beyond any notion of crisis in political circles. I focus on, in terms of the structure of the analysis, I focus on the impact of different objectives which the two national governments, the Swedish government and the German government, pursued in the wake of the 2015 so-called crisis in their policymaking. And I look at these two countries because they both have, of course, an outstanding role in the context of this crisis. Namely, both stood kind of at the forefront of the so-called crisis, in that they initially opened their borders, took in a lot more asylum seekers per capita and also in total numbers than other EU member states. They presented themselves as moral superpowers, but after a short period of openness, both countries changed their stance towards refugees and asylum seekers under the impression of growing public anxiety vis-à-vis those seeking shelter. And these similar reactions are particularly remarkable, considering that both are fundamentally different when it comes to their systems, to their regimes, with regard to healthcare and incorporation, amongst others. So given that the similar governmental courses of action in both countries cannot be sufficiently explained through a regime approach or an examination of policy traditions, I, in this paper, seek to contextualize and understand what reasons and what reasoning drove the two governments to act in the way that they did. And by this approach, this paper seeks to understand, again, to what extent the resulting policy changes can be considered mere crisis reactions of short duration, or to what extent they might shape policies in the mid to long term, also beyond healthcare. The data that I'm using for my analysis is a pool of policy documents. Of course, I look at legislation and also at the way leading up to the legislation, namely draft bills and explanations submitted by the respective governments. I look at government declarations and decisions in order to understand what motives and what objectives, again, the governments were driving the governments in their policy making. In that same sense, I also look at statements by ministries and by responsible state agencies who are also involved in the incorporation and healthcare regimes. I also look at how the governments presented their logics of action, not only towards other political circles, but to the public by looking at press releases and information material, And finally, I analyzed speeches by members of government in parliamentary plenary debates and their answers to parliamentary questions, etc. So when we come now to the analysis and to the first findings, I want to present to you 3 objectives that I found to be, first of all, similar between the 2 countries, and then also to be particularly impactful on the policy changes that resulted from the so-called crisis following 2015. First of all, I found the objective of preventing high healthcare standards as a pull factor. So both countries sought to communicate to potential asylum seekers in their policy response with regard to access to healthcare, that only those with a rightful claim to protection would get full or near full access to the host country's welfare and healthcare system, whereas those who unjustly sought asylum would have to count on significant access restrictions. In other words, the 2 governments both sought to prevent rumors of too favorable healthcare and welfare access becoming, again, the idea of a pull factor here. Really, I wish to distance myself from that concept from an academic point of view, but this really appears very strongly in the policymaking of both governments. Both the governments pursued this course of action not through a collective lowering of healthcare standards. This is important to note. Instead, they addressed restrictive measures at those with a low probability of entitlement to a refugee or subsidiary protection status, for instance, because of their background from a so-called safe country of origin. So that the governments wanted to make clear those who do not deserve protection will not get any, to again prevent kind of welfare migration, as it is referred to. The objective of avoiding this kind of high healthcare standards as pull factor phenomenon appears in German governmental documents much more explicitly than in Swedish ones, possibly because of different national traditions. So it should be noted that Germany has resorted to the same strategy of open deterrence through the lowering of social standards already in the past, where Sweden has rather proudly emphasized in the past its open, its liberal incorporation regime, and its perception of asylum seekers and refugees as future members of society. So while considering the step of deterrence through restrictions necessary, there was much more uneasiness on the side of the Swedish government in adopting this course of action than we find on the German ones.
Till 2 minutes.
Yes, perfect. As the second objective of high impact, I found the objective of pleasing voters. So again, if we look at this insider-outsider scheme in healthcare and in incorporation systems, with regard to the insiders of the respective healthcare systems, the 2 governments were very eager to show to their voters that their government would put them first, would be careful to prevent an overburdening of an already strained national healthcare system through outsiders. And this distinct role attribution to insiders and outsiders is very clear in the analyzed policy documents. So this is clearly emphasized by both governments. Pressure in this regard increased because particularly of shifts in public opinion that I already mentioned, and also to some extent related to shifts in public opinion with the perceived growing threat of far-right parties' electoral successes. So we had national elections in Germany in 2017, in Sweden 2018, and we have one party in each country kind of pushing for higher voting numbers, the Sweden Democrats in Sweden and the Alternative for Germany in Germany. So while far-right parties' actual success has, of course, the potential to push governing or moderate parties in general either to make a point of adopting an explicitly immigration-friendly course or to try and win skeptical voters back by adopting a more restrictive policy line and language, I found mostly the latter. So more restrictive language, more restrictive action with regard to asylum seekers and refugees' access to health care. And I find one reason for that in the increasing politicization, not only of incorporation, that of course is a longer process, but recently also of healthcare, so that here policymakers really seek to please their voters specifically in this area. With regard to specific policy changes addressed at insiders, addressed at voters, there's a notable difference between the 2 countries in that the Swedish government sought first and foremost to reduce the overall burden on the healthcare system by reducing the number of outsiders having access to it, whereas the German government also adopted a range of measures towards increased efficiency, lower costs for actors within the system. So it wasn't only restriction in the German case, there were also some aid measures that were adopted. Finally, I found the objective of upholding a sustainable international role model position to be very influential in policymaking. So both governments emphasized the leading role of their country within the EU, repeatedly emphasized their exemplary compliance with international rules and conventions without necessarily naming them, but they really put emphasis on how morally superior they would act in comparison to other EU member states and other countries in general. However, both governments also stated that they would be unable to uphold high standards if in the long term other member states kept their standards low, which, again, the governments feared, made those few countries in a vanguard position regarding asylum seekers and refugees' social rights target countries of more asylum seekers than their respective healthcare systems could absorb. So both governments actually specifically named the lack of solidarity among EU member states and the failure of the EU asylum system as reasons making restrictive policy changes necessary. Particularly the Swedish government also emphasized that it could only return to its high standards if other member states followed suit. And so this makes clear that the Swedish government basically intends to keep its crisis response restrictive turn as long as it takes for other countries to lift their standards, and so well into the future potentially. And
Thank
finally,
you, Mechthild. I'm going to have to cut you off there because you've gone over by several minutes, but maybe you can address in the response session because we'll come back, and I'm aware we only have 20 minutes for that, and we all have to be on time for the keynote speech.
Perfect.
All
Sorry
right,
for running over. Thank you.
You got through those very important governmental objections for restricting access to healthcare, which actually were very interesting and somewhat contradictory, especially with the last one, and how governments could possibly achieve those things. So if I could ask all of the speakers to put their videos back on so we can see everyone all together, that would be nice. There've been busy bees in the chat, including myself. You can ignore my questions and give preference, of course, to the rest of the attendees. 2 minutes each. Let's try and do 2 rounds if we possibly can. Pick 1 or 2 questions that you think are most pertinent to your research. I really think this was a very, very good panel, and we did a bit of a tour du monde, en fait, with the various countries that were investigated. And Emily clarified also in the chat that she was not focusing on the United States specifically, but of course she was looking this global Latin America, Asia and Africa, but she will tell us more to correct that, any misunderstandings. So I suggest then we go back in the order that we started. So Diana, do you have a question or 2 that you wish to respond to now? And I'll give you 2 minutes. If you can put your microphone on.
Yeah, I've seen some questions coming in. I will try perhaps to I don't know, give a bit of an overview and my opinion on the current situation. So yeah, there were some questions about encampment and freedom of movement. And I think they go hand in hand with the right of work, of course, because rights are interconnected. So freedom of movement also was part of one of the pledges, and the pledge actually said that 10% of encamped refugees were to be given freedom of movement. But in the same way as the proclamation was written for the right of work, whereby the government can decide to release work permits if it wants to, or choose not to. So the government pretty much keeps control on what is happening and how much he expands policies. In the same way, it's done a bit the same with the encampment policy, whereby it says that it does retain the possibility to restrict the choice of residence if it wants to. And so effectively, that's what it does. So it's still very much controlling the situation. So I think if we think in practical terms for Ethiopia, and I think for a country of with those kind of issues, economic issues, trying to become an industrialized country, of course, it's going to look at the development approach as the solution, because it's practical, because it helps it go into the direction where it wants to grow economically, and it's trying to bring with it the refugees and use refugees a bit as a currency to attract investments and include them in this economic process. Now, I didn't mean to be particularly critical of Ethiopia's position as such, because I don't see how else it could do it, quite honestly, and it doesn't really have the capacity right now to absorb 800,000 refugees into its workforce. So it needs practical solutions in order to respond to self-reliance strategies and initiatives, while also balancing its own interests as a country. And so in the spirit of responsibility sharing, this is a bit of a solution in a way. The issue is that, okay, so on one hand, we have Ethiopia doesn't have the capacity to absorb, and so it could be quite unrealistic to expect that it opens the national labor market. But at the same time, the issue has been that this development approach has not been refugee-centric. So while I understand, obviously, is a strategy for Ethiopia to merge its interests and so forth, at the same time, these kind of solutions have apparently been including refugees, but in practice, again, they have not. So the practice is always very different from the intentions. So in the creation of the job compact, for example, refugees, is really still very unclear how many can get jobs there. They've discovered that the jobs at the industrial park are the lowest paid in the world. They don't really guarantee livelihood. It would be they're not near the camps at all. So it brings up the whole question of housing, and which is a real problem in the cities adjacent to the industrial parks. It doesn't allow the rest of the family to work. Most of the jobs are actually more suitable to women and not. So it was a solution, a development solution, but in practice, it wasn't refugee-centric, and therefore, or refugees were, the interests of refugees were very poorly represented. And so I think this is the part that we really need to focus on.
Great, thank you very much, Diana. And I take note if anyone else wants to make comments on the encampment policies and freedom of movement, because I think it's relevant to some of the other speakers also, but also just making a comment there that settlements in Uganda were the one way in which they allowed refugees to earn a livelihood, so that they didn't restrict movement, but of course they restricted residence, and they didn't restrict any livelihood capacity, and also this attracting investment. As I presume you're Italian, are you, Diana?
I am,
well,
yes.
It reminds me when you said 800,000 refugees absorbed them into the workforce. Read what your Italian delegate said at the drafting of the 1951 convention. And he said that the economic consequences of the Second World War were much greater than they had ever expected to absorb 250,000 Jewish refugees into their labor market, and hence advocated for the reservations. So it is interesting that we've all come a long way, right, in what we expect. But of course, you know, there are realities on the ground, and I'm always reminded that actually Europe was grappling with many of the things that developing countries are grappling with today, and maybe we've got too high standards, I don't know. I am moving then to Emily.
Thanks, and I think I'll start by addressing the question from Cecilia, I believe, on how do we address legacy warehousing, and Cecilia posed the question of, do we need a new agency or a new approach? Do we need something like a joint ILO, UNHCR mechanism? And I do think we need to address the legacy of warehousing, which is another term for the internment of refugees, the confinement of refugees into camps that they are not allowed to leave. That in itself violates the right of freedom of movement in the convention, but also obviously has clear impacts on the ability to truly access the right to wage earning and self-employment, so different types of work, and also work rights. If you're confined, prison labor is not known for its adherence to labor rights standards. That said, I don't know that I would say that an ILO UNHCR joint mechanism is necessarily the most effective mechanism. One of the things that ILO and UNHCR have in common is that they are not treaty enforcement mechanisms. And unlike other human rights treaties, we really don't have an oversight body for the Refugee Convention. So I would say that might be the first place to start. The other human rights conventions generally have treaty oversight bodies that are able to say to a state, you are violating your obligations under this treaty. And it would be great to have the same thing for the Refugee Convention. I think the UNHCR's role as an advisor to governments has been to some extent subsumed and co-opted by its role in providing humanitarian assistance. And that's not to say that humanitarian coordination isn't necessary, but it means that there are often ethical incentives, or there are often incentives rather, for UNHCR to act in ways that violate the convention or collude in actions that violate the convention in order to maintain humanitarian access. And that's highly problematic if UNHCR is the only body responsible for the Refugee Convention. I think we also need to look at the practical dynamics of this. The World Bank is becoming a much greater influence in refugee response. And in fact, World Bank money was behind the Jordan Compact and the Ethiopia Compact, both of which are at the same time good initial steps toward greater work rights for refugees, and also highly problematic with their restrictions on sectors, with their insistence on pushing refugees into jobs that refugees generally don't want, and are not favorable conditions, rather than respecting and enforcing the rights of refugees where they are. Malaysia has actually done something really interesting in that in Malaysia, labor rights, work rights apply to anyone who is working, whether or not they are authorized, whether or not they are lawfully in the country. And so labor rights can be enforced for refugee workers, even as Malaysia provides no way for refugees to have any sort of regularized legal status recognized by the Malaysian government. And that approach might be actually a more fruitful one. But coming back to the World Bank, where the World Bank is investing in labor market access, or in programs that are designed to achieve labor market access, I think we, as a community, as a global community who care about refugees' human rights and the Refugee Convention, can push for the World Bank to be accountable to refugees' human rights. And I think this isn't going to happen at the implementer level from World Bank. It needs to be something that the executive directors of the World Bank, which are the countries that govern the World Bank, they have to demand. And so we might be able to get there, but that will take, I think, a significant advocacy effort. And then just maybe to say briefly, and I think Diana may have mentioned this as well, but when we talk about the quote unquote realities on the ground, the research out there shows that when countries do allow refugees access, ideally unfettered access, or the benefits are greater when it's unfettered access to the labor market, that at least at the country level, the economic benefits inhere to everyone, to the countries, to the economies, to citizens, as well as to refugees. And there is a very common misconception, and I hear folks working in advocacy for refugees say frequently that, oh, well, we can't open our labor market because it would hurt nationals who are also struggling. And I think those arguments, that misconception, will continue to be repeated in the wake of COVID, just as it was repeated by the Italian delegate at the time of the drafting. But it's important for us to remember that the research doesn't actually show that. There are issues at the micro level. So, in one town with one particular trade, you might start to have a glut before the market equalizes itself. And those issues do need to be addressed. But at a slightly more macro level, at the country level, it is not a detriment to national workers to allow refugees to work lawfully and to protect their labor rights, right? Refugees are already working. The problem is if their labor rights aren't protected, then they do accept lower wages, accept worse working conditions, unsafe working conditions, which tends to drive down wages and working conditions for everyone. And that's what the evidence actually shows. So I think we really need to turn ourselves back to what the data shows and not to these kind of assumptions and misconceptions about how work rights play out in practice.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for addressing those. I think on your last point, it would be good to reflect on whether those statistics are available well beyond the academic environment. And the other is, of course, you touched on the kernel of the dramas of the international refugee regime, of this failure of a supervisory body other than UNHCR that has independence and not this conflict of interest. I wonder whether that plays out with the other speakers too. So now, Tamara.
Yes, thank you. I saw your question with regards to the UNRWA and the UNHCR, and I will come back to that. But let me first start maybe by building on what Emily was also saying. And I think she raises an interesting point about the labor rights. Now, of course, the labor rights should be guaranteed. I fully stand behind that. One of the challenges is that we often are dealing with economies where you already have a high informal economy, where not just the refugees are working, but also people from the country themselves. So Jordanians, particularly in the lower strata, tend to work there as well. Now, I agree that the evidence is quite interesting, because if you look at studies done on Jordan, amongst others, what you do find is that the refugees do not necessarily compete with the Jordanians. That's largely because a lot of Jordanians, there is a high level of education among Jordanians, higher than amongst refugees, but they particularly compete with other migrant groups. And at the same time, this is sad to also be somewhat concerning and challenging, because if you look at the sectors that were opened up, for example, the manufacturing sector, where they wanted refugees to work in special economic zones, one of the challenges is firstly, the location of those zones are often not located closely to where refugees are living. And it would be problematic for some to even go and stay in a guest house at the economic zone, because they still have their family to look after as well. Whereas often a migrant who comes by himself, comes to work for a temporary period and then tends to go back. So the dynamic and the context proves to be already a little bit challenging. But additionally, then there is the quota system that is in place, where you say, okay, a certain amount of refugees needs to be, or a certain amount of there can be a maximum percentage of foreign workers within companies. So sometimes you see that this is set at 30%, I believe, when I did my research. And then the challenge is that to be eligible for all this nice import trade tariffs, etc., to the EU under the Jordan Compact, you needed to have a certain percentage of refugees, but then you put them in sectors where that are already highly reliant on foreign workers. So with whom are they directly competing then? And the challenge then for certain companies is that it requires an investment in skills as well to make sure that they can do the job. So there are all these additional levels of complications that come sometimes to the practice. But it is very important. And I was interested to hear about the case of Malaysia, because when I think about labor rights, partly what I also think about is social protection, which is partly what I also work on. And that is often a challenge. What we notice with refugees is that they're not necessarily interested in contributing to social insurance, because they don't feel that they can take that with them when they do go back eventually to Syria, which seems to be then part of the discussion. So to an extent, some actually choose to work rather informally rather than formally, because it gives them a bit more freedom in that sense. So to what extent do we consider, and I'm just putting it out there, but to what extent do we consider the freedom of choice in that regard on the side of the individual? It makes it for a very challenging debate, and I don't necessarily have the answer to that. But yes, I will skip the encampment just very briefly on the UNRWA versus the UNHCR. I didn't want to go into the full classification system, but of course this does make a difference to the extent that under the UNHCR Syrian Refugee Response Plan, there is, of course, the Livelihoods Working Group, which is led by the UNHCR and the DRC, and that is particularly aimed at the Syrian refugees. So it by default tends to overlook the other refugees because the non-Syrian refugees, in particular the Palestinian refugees, as these fall outside the mandate of the UNHCR and fall under the mandate of the UNRWA. But now the complication becomes, okay, when we talk about Palestinians, refugees, what are we actually talking about? Because some of them are stated to also, well, the majority of them have received citizenship, though the citizenship was taken away from some of them as well over the past years. There have been reports by Human Rights Watch, amongst others, on this. And then you have a group like the Gazan refugees. We do not hold citizenship, nor were ever given. And that's also where you see that over time there seemed to have been a restriction in terms of the refugee regime and the way that Jordan handled the refugees in Jordan as well, and the restriction of rights that came with it. But then due to the international pressure and also partly, I guess, due to the World Bank interest, there is a particular focus on including Syrians. But we have over 48 different refugee nationalities in Jordan, and we do need to be considerate of the other nationalities on how they can be provided with a better access to work as well in that regard. But I will stop it here. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tamara. Yes, a complicated question, just because your research said Palestinian refugees and then Syrian refugees, and whether that impacted. It'd be good to explain that in your bigger paper, but you also mentioned context being very important. And I haven't heard anyone talk about urban versus rural and these questions about, well, these centers are not near where the refugees live. It makes me wonder where they're living. Are they in urban centers, or are the centers or these zones being put well out into the districts? Like we see a lot of industrial zones these days in countries, even without considering refugees. But to give Mechthild enough time to respond, because it's always difficult being the last one, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Thanks for the questions. Regarding the UN Convention Against Torture, yes, that's very interesting, and it appears very, very rarely, because to get at this to this stage kind of declaring that you're deserving of help, of specific healthcare in this case, you would have to really prove that you deserve it now in both countries. So in Germany, this was the case already before, but Sweden changed this now, so that kind of the proxy is that you're not considered deserving in a way, and then you have to prove it. But generally, there's rarely a specific reference to UN conventions or international conventions in general. So both countries, again, both governments just really like to emphasize how well they are applying international standards and how they're going beyond them. But then when you look into the details, that's not actually the case, because specifically when it comes to healthcare, they are actually underperforming in a lot of senses. So I really like the point that Emily made about there not being any enforcing institution, any enforcing body. So that would be really an utter necessity also in the area of healthcare, because again, there are infringements, I believe. And thank you also for the question on what the kind of policy making, the policy changes that were implemented in both countries mean for the implementation. So when it comes to practitioners, to healthcare providers, there is definitely an impact. So what I heard from practitioners, but also what research shows, is that they tend to be confused. First of all, they tend to be confused what they are now allowed to offer to asylum seekers and refugees. They tend to be overwhelmed. They tend to, in part, even reject asylum seekers who are entitled to healthcare because they don't know what exactly applies now and to what extent they're allowed to provide healthcare. And in the German case, this means that if you, as a practitioner, as a doctor, if you provide healthcare that wasn't covered by legislation to asylum seekers and refugees, you have to pay it yourself. And some don't want to take that risk. So there is really a significant level of confusion, which is something the German government wanted to address with what I said, these kind of efficiency increasing measures that they adopted alongside restrictions of access to healthcare for asylum seekers and refugees. So again, yeah, that on the side of the healthcare providers. On the side of asylum seekers themselves, there is absolutely no evidence that suggests that this would make any difference whatsoever on where people are trying to go, to what extent people have access to healthcare in the host country. Rather the contrary. So there's scientific evidence that it has no impact whatsoever. So actually, I was thinking whether this objective of not creating a so-called pull factor, whether that shouldn't even be moved to the group of objectives addressed to voters, that the governments are trying to show their voters, hey, here, we're preventing people from coming, even though, again, it has been shown so far. I have not seen any evidence that said that it would actually work. So yeah, maybe I have to kind of shift parts there. And since it's 1621, sorry, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mechthild, and thank you very much to everyone on today's panel. I think very thought-provoking papers, excellent detailed and depth of research that you've already covered, and of course, a great expertise amongst you. Thanks also to the participants for all the very good questions, and hopefully there'll be an opportunity for you to follow up if there's anything that was particularly interesting or intriguing to take up with others. I think that is the conclusion of our session, but I do note that the next session is the distinguished keynote of Professor James Hathaway. So let's all stick around for that and have a break beforehand. But congratulations, really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.